Hey there, you looking kinda cute. Please consider subscribing and check out our Patreon for more. Enjoy the video. Steve sat in his favorite tree and looked out over the fields. He swung his legs as he watched the setting sun. He was happy with himself because his latest mischief didn't get him in trouble. He was able to lock most of the doors to the Martins' farmhouse and make only one door open. He laughed to himself as he sat there and threw stones from his pocket into the stream that ran under the tree. He wasn't a bad boy. He just liked to mess around and make jokes every once in a while to show that he was a boy. You see, he was hiding something and sometimes it showed. Inside, he was a girl, but he didn't want the other guys at his school to find out. He was called feminine sometimes because he had long hair and looked like a girl. Back at home, he had hidden one of his older sister's old Barbies under his bed in the mess, and at night, he would play with it. He planned his next operation while he sat in the branches of the old oak. At the end of the town, there was an old house that had been empty for as long as he could remember. Slowly, it got dark, so he got down from the tree and went home. On the way, he looked at the old church clock and saw that it was still pretty early. His mother and sister would not be home for about an hour. He didn't like that his mom and sister had to work so much and that his dad had left when he was young. His mother never told him she was sorry, but she did the best she could. There were times when his mother gave up on him and how he was acting. When she heard about his latest tricks, she would shake her head. His sister was the tough one. When he did something wrong, she would grab him by the ear and force him to apologize. When he got to the door of the house where he and his family lived, he put his hand under a stone by the door and opened it. He went to the kitchen, opened the fridge, and poured himself a big glass of milk. His school bag was still on the table in the kitchen, where he had put it when he got home from school that day. He thought about doing some of his homework, but he chose not to and went to his room instead. He shut his door and reached under his bed for his stash. He took Barbie and the few outfits he had for her out of her hidden place. After about an hour of happy playing, he looked at his alarm clock and saw that it was about 30 minutes after his mother was supposed to get home from work. Also, he couldn't hear his older sister in the house, so he was worried about where they were. He went to his window and looked down the street to see if he could see his mother's car. He saw it in the driveway. He went to his door and opened it to find out why he couldn't hear anything. He finally heard someone crying softly, so he walked down the stairs to the lounge. His mother and sister were sitting on the couch, and Maria looked up at him with a hard face. He saw that his mom was holding a formal letter, so he slowly walked over to her and tried to read it backwards. It was from the owner and a development company. It looked like Mom was in trouble, and he started to feel bad about all the jokes he had made and the way he had been acting. "Steve, please sit down. Your mom wants to talk to you," Maria told him in a harsh tone. His sister could be very mean when she talked, but he knew she loved him. "What's that?" He snarled and acted like he wasn't worried, but he really was. Maria reached out and, to my surprise, shoved him to the floor and pulled his hair. She looked at her mother and could see that she was trying to stop crying. "Steve, what are you doing?" she asked him gently but strongly. "What did you say, Mom?" When he asked, his voice broke. "People have reported to the landlord and the company that owns the houses because of you. This could cause us to lose our home." Maria looked at him as she left the room and went upstairs. Her face turned cloudy as she did so. Big Sister was moving around in his room, and he tried to remember where he had put Barbie. At last, someone from upstairs yelled, and Maria came down with a smile on her face and something in her hand. As she walked to her mom and whispered in her ear, she smiled at Steve and gave him a wink. His mother also smiled and took the thing away from him to look at it. She also gave Steve a close look, nodded as if she had made up her mind, stood up, and left the room with a soft laugh. Steve started to worry about what they had found and what they were going to do. He felt bad about putting them in that situation and wondered if there was anything he could do to change it. He went straight for the door, out into the village streets, and toward the old house without stopping to think. He walked past it and into the dark night. He felt bad about himself. How could he have been so bad that they were kicked out? He walked around in the dark, without looking where he was going. He could hear his mom and sister yelling for him. He didn't hear them and walked into the old house's overgrown yard by accident. He got to the house's wall and had to feel his way around because there wasn't enough light. He got to the front door, which was open for some reason. The yard around him was also changing. He went into the old house's hallway, which looked like it was still occupied. He got scared when he heard someone moving around and the old, heavy, and well-polished furniture. He remembered what he was going to do here earlier in the day. Now, all he wanted to do was make things better for his mom. He wished there was some way to go back in time a few years. He had acted out when his body started changing, and he seemed to want to be one of the boys. People in the town remembered that he was a kind boy who liked to play with the younger kids. He would play house with the girls and kick a ball around with the boys. He used to be a kind boy, and he knew that he changed because he wanted to fit in with his friends. He thought about his first joke and frowned when he remembered that a girl had cried because of it. His face fell, and he sat on the stairs of the house with his head in his hands, feeling very sad. As he sat there, tears ran down his face, and he looked through the tears to see how fine his hands were. He must have sat there and cried and looked at his hands for an hour because he was so lost in his own world of sadness. He started to think that maybe it would be better if he ran away so that his mother and older sister wouldn't have to live on the streets. He really thought about it, and then he made up his mind. He was going to do that. He was going to leave the village so his mother and sister wouldn't get into problems. He got up and walked back out the door into the night. The moon was full, so there was a lot of light. He took the road out of the place where he grew up. His steps were heavy, and he was hungry. He realized that the last time he ate was during lunch at school. He didn't care about it. He squared his shoulders and kept going. Back in the town, Maria and Sarah's mother, who was also Steve's mother, was getting worried. At 10 p.m., there was still no sign of the boy, so Sarah started to run up and down the village road. Maria was getting worried about her younger brother, so she walked toward the old house. When she got to the door, a middle-aged woman was there and smiled at her. She led the young woman inside and put her on a couch in the living room without saying a word. The older woman smiled and sat down in a big stuffed chair to watch her surprise visitor. She smiled and looked over the top of her half-moon-shaped glasses. "I see that you're having trouble tonight, Maria," she said it in a soft voice. "Yes, ma'am, it's my brother Steve. There's a problem in the family. I see, and that's why you were out this late." "Yes." The woman smiled and looked softly at what was going on with the girl's face. Then she stopped and looked at her closely. She thought about what she saw in the girl's mind and reached out with her own. As she spread her awareness, she could feel Steve's mind out on the road. She also knew that Steve had been in the house but hadn't seen her. She was a witch, but not a bad one. She used her gift to help people and heal them. Most people don't believe in magic anymore, but when she was young, everyone in the town looked up to her. She decided that as she reached out to find the boy, she could feel him getting farther away from the town. She could also see his future, and what she saw made her go white. She didn't want that to happen, so she used her powers to get the job done. She used her mind to reach out and grab the boy's sad thoughts, and then with a little twist, she led him back to the town. She smiled as she reached out and pulled a hair from Maria's head quickly. "I'm sorry, honey, but I have to." Steve was getting cold, and his stomach was starting to hurt and grumble. He gave a shrug and kept going. He stopped, turned around, and started walking back toward the town. He wasn't going back to the cottage. Instead, he was going to the old house. Something about the house kept drawing him back. He didn't know what was pulling him back there, especially since he knew that if he went back, his mom would find him and they would be kicked out. No matter what he did, he was going back to the old house. He shook his head, kept going, and picked up his pace. As he got closer to the old house, his mind was getting clearer. When he got to the last few yards, he was almost running to the door. He could see his sister's shape in the light, so he stopped and jumped into the garden's bordering bush. He was glad that his sister didn't see him, and after Maria went, he walked slowly to the door. In the hallway, a woman was waiting for him with a soft smile. Steve had the feeling that he knew her from somewhere, but he didn't know where. She grabbed his hand and led him up the stairs, where he had been crying before. As she led him down the hallway to a room at the end, she walked slowly and with dignity. "Steve, don't worry, I won't hurt you." "What are you saying?" He was so scared that his voice was shaking. "You're upset about what happened, and your mom and sister are worried about you because you ran away. But you break things and run away like a child." The woman's tone of voice changed. Steve jerked away from the voice's criticism, and he finally stopped to look around the room. Sets of test tubes and other glass things with bubbling and steaming liquids were sitting on a bench. He was able to calm down in the room because it smelled like lavender and other sweet flowers. He took a deep breath, smiled, and looked at the woman. She smiled and winked, then changed again until she looked like she was in her mid-20s. "Now I have the strength to do what needs to be done," she spoke. What do you plan to do to me?" After seeing what the woman had just done, Steve began to shake out of fear. "You can call me Grace, and I promise not to do anything to hurt you." "Okay, Grace, but what will you do?" "Why, I'll just give you what you want." She took a wand from the bench and waved it in the air. Out of thin air, a mirror appeared. It looked old, and its frame was made of dark wood and was carved in some way. Steve was pulled to the mirror, and he looked at its shiny surface for a while. He was pulled to look into the mirror because it looked foggy and hard to see anything in it. The mirror's surface started to look like a picture. Steve smiled when he saw a younger version of himself playing with and watching out for the neighborhood. The picture changed again, and this time it showed his first joke, which made him frown. Then it turned again, and he saw an older version of himself standing on a street corner. He was thin and looked sick. The older him got into a car that pulled up, and the picture got cloudy again. Steve turned to look at Grace. She nodded as if to confirm that he had just seen his future as a runaway. His mind chewed over the facts, and he realized that he had to work on the streets to survive. He started crying so hard that his whole body was shaking. He covered his face to break the mirror's spell. He wanted to say that what he had seen and how sad it made him were not true. Grace listened to the boy cry out in pain, and she looked at him closely and intently. She said, "Steve, you can change it." "How if I go home, my mother will be kicked out because of me? If Steve goes home, that is. But I'm not like anyone else, so it doesn't matter. Steve, you remember how you played when you were little?" Steve thought hard, and then he smiled. He remembered that he and his sister used to play dress-up, and Steve would wear his sister's clothes from when she was younger. He remembers that his sister liked him and that they played dolls and had tea parties together. He smiled wider, let out a happy sigh, and started to face the mirror again. It started to clear up again, and images of a girl playing with her bigger sister and mother played over the surface. She was a happy child who liked playing. As Steve watched, he saw that the adults in the picture were his sister and his mother. The girl was laughing and hugging her mother and older sister. The picture changed again, and now the girl was wearing a pretty dress and looked like she was ready for a party. There were a lot of gifts, and a man who seemed nice helped the child open some of them. As Steve watched, he could tell that the man was his father because he had seen pictures of him that his mother had kept. The man was tickling the girl to make her laugh, and Steve was left laughing with the girl all by himself. "Grace? Who is she? She looks so happy." He looked into the mirror and asked, "She is what you want to be, Steve." He listened to the woman talk, and for the first time he found himself looking deep into his own mind. He looked back at the fun times he had with Maria when he was younger. Also, he remembered how his mom felt when she saw his bigger sister dress him up and how much she loved him. She even took him to a party dressed as the little girl, where all the women kept giving him hugs. He also remembered how good he felt at that time in his life. He remembered that his sister and mom had called him Steffi and treated him like a pretty little girl. He started to think hard about how he felt inside. and the feeling of fear was replaced by a warm glow in his heart. Grace watched the boy closely and was surprised by how hypnotized he seemed to be. The mirror suddenly lit up, and the light from it wrapped around the person standing in front of it. "Oh, no!" Steve screamed when he saw the light. Grace acted quickly and held a small globe in front of the mirror. The light flowed into the ball. As the ball took in the light from the mirror, it began to get warmer, glow, and pulse. Grace checked Steve quickly and saw that his body hadn't changed, so she let out a quick sigh. She then looked into the boy's eyes and saw that he was still dreaming. She decided to ask him some questions. "Can you hear me, Steve?" "Yes, Steve. That's fine." "How old are you?" "What is his name?" "All right, who are you?" "I'm Steffi." "Steffi, and I want Mommy and Marie." "What are you, Steffi?" "Silly woman, I'm a big girl. I am female." The voice was proud. Grace stared hard at her wand for a few seconds as she thought about what to do next. This was the first time the mirror had acted like this, and the ball looked like it was getting darker. She wondered if there was more, so she used her mind to reach out. She ran into Steffi's mind, and didn't find what she was expecting to find. The boy's soul was not broken, and he seemed to have no flaws. The soul had been fixed by the mirror, but she had stopped the change in the middle. She opened her book of spells and began to chant. This gave her the power she needed to make the change. She felt her body grow and fill up as the power moved through her and made her the vessel for it. She took her wand and gripped the white rowan so hard that her knuckles were visible and her body stiffened. She held back a scream and then let some of her power go. It landed on the boys' clothes, and they slowly put on a party dress to match what they saw in the mirror. Then, instead of shorts, she wore frilly Roomba underwear, and instead of a t-shirt, she wore a shift and petticoats. The shoes and socks were changed to ones that a girl would wear. She opened the channel even more, and the power screamed out of her and into the boy standing there. The light turned a darker shade of pink, and a heartbeat could be heard. Steffi, just stood there as the light grew around her and got too bright to look at. Grace covered her eyes as the light got brighter and her power began to leave her. She leaned against the bench a little bit. She was amazed to see how the boy began to change. At first, the body started to get smaller and a layer of fat covered it. The hair turned into a mop of blonde curls and the bangs covered the face. The face changed into a soft face, and the legs got fat. The hands got smaller, and a girl stood there with a big smile on her face. "I'm sure my mom will be mad." The voice was high-pitched. Grace laughed, and when she was ready, she helped the girl get dressed. And the girl gave her a hug. Once the girl was dressed, she danced around the room laughing, which made everyone else laugh too. Grace laughed again, and as she did, she could feel her body getting stronger. When someone knocked on the door, Grace led the girl down the stairs to the front door by holding her hand. She could feel the reality change coming from the house, and she smiled as she felt it touch many lives. The effect on people's lives and on Steve's mark on the world was soft, but the changes were not big. She opened the door and saw that Maria and Sarah were standing there, looking worried. When Sarah saw the girl, she looked down and smiled. She then put her arms out to her. The girl ran up to her and laughed as he did so. He gave her a tight hug. Maria laughed. Soon, the whole hallway was full of laughter. Grace smiled because she was the only one who remembered the boy who had come to the house to get away from the trouble he had caused. Steffi was laughing as she looked over at the witch woman with a big smile on her young face. "Thank you for taking care of everything." She tried to do a curtsy, but was not very good at it. Not long after, Steffi walked with her mother and older sister to the house. A car sped into the driveway, and a man jumped out of it, looking worried. "Where have you been, Stephanie Carey Harold's?" As he got down to her level, he asked. "Daddy!" Steffi screamed and ran to her father. The man picked her up, swung her around, and put her back on her feet with a smile. "Honey, where have you been? Daddy has been looking for you for hours. And we thought a bad man had taken you, sweetie. I'm sorry, Dad, but I got lost and a nice lady found me and took me home." James held his daughter's head in his hands and gave her a good kiss on the face. He led the way back to the cottage and gave Sarah a worried look as he did so. Maria took her sister Steffi into the kitchen because she could see that their parents needed to talk without her. Steffi yawned and smiled at her older sister. Maria's college work was spread out on the table, and her younger sister sat down and started to work on a problem. She also saw that her older sister was having trouble with a math problem and that there was a blank piece of paper and a pencil nearby. She started with the problem, saw the answer and how to get there, and then began to write. Maria smiled because she thought her little sister was just playing at school. Then she looked at the paper and saw that the numbers were written in a childish way. She was good at math when she was Steve. Steffi remembered that math was the only subject Steve never got bored of, so she worked on the formula. As she worked with the numbers, they seemed to move like a ballet to her. She was happy, but she was still surprised that she looked and sounded like a girl. Maria watched the writing flow, and when she looked at the problem her teacher had given her, she thought it was a bit hard. When Steffi finished the problem, she smiled and looked up from the scrawled paper to see her older sister's shocked face. After a few minutes of silence, Maria gave Steffi a tight hug. She started babbling about what she had just seen, and Steffi wondered if she was going to get in trouble for what she had done. Maria put her mind at ease when she read through the problem and saw that the answer was easy to follow. She yelled for their parents with a huge smile on her face. When Sarah and James went into the kitchen, they saw their two girls holding hands and Maria crying. Maria kept laughing about what was on the paper while she pointed to it and the problem. James was a scientist at a local lab, and he looked over the paper carefully. His oldest daughter had trouble with math, so he thought Maria was making a joke. Then he looked more closely and saw that it was written by his younger daughter. His face fell. "Did Maria teach you how to do this, honey?" "No, Daddy," Steffi said with a smile. "I did it all by myself, Dad. She did it. When I first saw her, I thought she was playing school and copying me." Maria was able to calm down enough to answer. James's face turned white when he read it again, so he put his younger daughter's shoulder and wrote down another problem. "Steffi, can you figure this out?" "Sure, Daddy, it's easy," Steffi said with a smile as she wrote the answer on a piece of paper without trying to figure it out. Now, she knew what would happen. Her dad looked at the piece of paper and he could just make out the words that were written on it. He turned the paper slowly back and forth while smiling. On the paper, there was what looked like an improvement on Einstein's theory of relativity. He couldn't believe that his 6-year-old daughter already knew so much. Then he noticed that his little girl was crying for another reason. "What is it, honey?" "Daddy, I lost all my dolls." "Sweetie, we'll have to get you new ones." The next day, the little girl's family went shopping to fill up her toy box and closet, but they couldn't remember where all her clothes went. The little girl was happy. She vaguely remembered that she used to be a difficult boy, but she was happy now. Her dad was here, and even though she was smart, her family loved her with all their hearts. Thanks for watching. Be sure to check out Patreon for a lot more content and early access to YouTube videos.